At 11:40 p.m., I was halfway through closing the bookstore where I worked when my father's old neighbor called and said, "Mara, you need to come to Briar Creek before your sister makes another mistake." And the fear in his voice was so sharp that I left without asking what he meant, driving nearly 2 hours through relentless rain toward the farmhouse where my 71-year-old father, Elias, had lived alone since my mother died. When I finally reached the outskirts of town, I found him sitting beneath the awning of a locked bus depot with a battered suitcase between his feet, his coat soaked through, his medication bottles rattling inside a plastic grocery bag, and a single sentence repeating in my head as I helped him into my car. They told me I didn't belong in my own house anymore. My younger sister, Natalie, had moved back home 8 months earlier with her husband, Grant, supposedly to help Dad recover after a minor stroke, and because I lived in another state and was overwhelmed with work, I accepted her cheerful updates that everything was under control, never realizing that under control meant his pension account had been redirected, his mail had stopped arriving, and his favorite chair had been moved into the hallway because Natalie said he was becoming difficult. As Dad warmed his hands around a cup of coffee at an all-night diner, he finally told me that Natalie had demanded he sign papers to simplify the property. Grant had taken his debit card for safekeeping, and earlier that evening they had driven him away after telling him the house needed emergency repairs. But what frightened me most was not the money. It was the small envelope he pulled from his suitcase containing a photograph of my mother, a handwritten note, and a key to a hidden cabinet Dad had never mentioned before. I wanted to confront Natalie immediately, but Dad stopped me and whispered, "Your sister knows exactly how to make me sound confused." So instead, I photographed every document, called an attorney named Evelyn Price, and learned that Dad had created a family trust years earlier that Natalie had never been authorized to alter, while the suspicious withdrawals were already being traced through several accounts connected to Grant's struggling construction company. Evelyn told me not to threaten anyone, not to warn Natalie, and not to touch anything inside the farmhouse until authorities could document it properly. Then she asked Dad what was inside the hidden cabinet, and his face changed completely when he answered, "Your mother kept records because she never trusted Grant." At dawn, we returned to Briar Creek with a sheriff's deputy, and Natalie opened the farmhouse door wearing my mother's old cardigan, immediately crying that Dad had become paranoid and that she and Grant had sacrificed everything to care for him, but Dad quietly held up the key and said, "Then you won't mind showing us what this opens," which wiped the expression from her face. The cabinet was concealed behind a false panel in the study, and inside were years of property records, bank statements, copies of Grant's business debts, and a small digital recorder containing my mother's voice explaining that she had discovered unusual transfers before her death and had warned Dad never to sign anything without independent advice. The real shock came when Evelyn examined a property agreement Natalie had tried to use to claim ownership of the farmhouse, because the signature looked convincing until a forensic document examiner compared it with Dad's genuine handwriting and found that several letters had been carefully imitated but written with completely different pressure and rhythm. Then the detective discovered security footage from a nearby pharmacy showing Grant entering a shipping store with Dad's identification, and the timeline suddenly made sense. They had not been planning to sell the farmhouse because they were desperate. They had been preparing to use it as collateral for a large loan, and Dad's sudden removal from the property was meant to keep him from discovering the transaction before it was completed. Natalie broke down when investigators confronted her with the evidence, but her tears quickly turned into anger as she pointed at me and shouted, "You weren't here when he needed someone, so don't pretend you're the hero now." And for a moment her words struck exactly where my guilt lived. Because I had missed birthdays, ignored several calls, and convinced myself that sending money was the same as being present. Dad, however, stepped between us and said, "Her absence may have hurt me, but it never gave you permission to steal from me." And that was the moment I understood that guilt can explain why we failed to notice danger, but it can never excuse the person who deliberately creates it. The investigation uncovered more than the attempted loan, including forged authorization forms, unauthorized purchases, altered medical records, and messages in which Grant instructed Natalie to make Dad appear unreliable if anyone questioned the missing money, while one message simply read, "Once the house is secured, nobody can force us out." Their plan had depended on everyone believing that family loyalty meant keeping disagreements private, but Evelyn turned every document into evidence, the bank froze the remaining funds, and the court issued an emergency order protecting Dad's property, preventing Natalie and Grant from contacting him or making further financial decisions on his behalf. Months later, Natalie admitted that Grant had convinced her they were entitled to the farmhouse because they had given up their lives to care for Dad, but the evidence showed that much of the money they claimed was compensation had actually been spent on personal debts, vacations, and a vehicle purchased under a false financial statement. And when the case finally reached court, Grant accepted a plea agreement involving fraud and financial exploitation, while Natalie received probation and restitution after admitting that she had knowingly helped conceal the transactions. Dad recovered most of the accessible funds, the fraudulent loan was canceled, the farmhouse remained legally his, and yet none of those victories erased the grief of realizing that the daughter he had protected for decades had been willing to gamble his security for a future she believed she deserved. A year later, Dad placed the hidden cabinet key on a hook beside his front door and told me he no longer wanted secrets protecting the family, only honesty protecting the people in it, while I began visiting every other weekend instead of assuming someone else would tell me how he was doing. He still keeps my mother's photograph on the mantle, Natalie's letters in a box he has not decided whether to open, and a handwritten list of people he trusts beside the telephone, and whenever I feel ashamed that I did not recognize the warning signs sooner, he reminds me, "You came when you understood what was happening, and then you stayed," which taught me that sometimes rebuilding a family does not mean restoring everything exactly as it was. It means creating something safer from the pieces that survived. If there is one lesson I carried away from that terrible night, it is that silence can look like peace while quietly giving danger room to grow. And when someone vulnerable is being manipulated behind the excuse of family care, protecting them may require uncomfortable questions, documented evidence, professional help, and the courage to let consequences fall where they belong. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.